Welcome to Paskvan Podcasts. Please like, subscribe, and comment. It really helps this channel. We are journeying into the shadows today, examining a story rooted in paper and ink, but one that stretches back into the deepest history, or perhaps the deepest desire of humankind. We're focusing on a single, unassuming manuscript that emerged from the Netherlands in the 1800s, and it carried a claim so radical it promised to shatter and rewrite the entire accepted history of Western civilization.
And this is more than just some historical curiosity. This was a chronicle that claimed to push the origins of European culture not just a few centuries back, but thousands of years before the accepted foundational myths, before the Greeks, before the Romans.
So it was a total reset.
A total reset. It tells the story of a lost northern empire, an advanced civilization of sailors and disciplined scholars, supposedly governed entirely by women, that vanished beneath a catastrophic flood.
And this document, the Oera Linda Book, it felt impossibly ancient.
But at the same time, to those who really understood the 19th century, it also felt suspiciously perfect.
Our mission today is to really unpack this specific enigma. We're going to explore the profound cultural void this document was seemingly custom designed to fill.
Right. We're going to look rigorously at what it claimed, the meticulous scientific scrutiny it underwent, and maybe most importantly, why. Why, despite being systematically exposed as a modern fabrication by experts, it remains this potent, enduring cultural symbol of forbidden truth.
It's a strange, unsettling inheritance.
It is. It's a document that, by all logic, simply should not exist as it claims to, yet it just refuses to be erased from the cultural imagination. We're really studying a phenomenon where objective evidence and these deeply held psychological needs, they just collide, creating a kind of historical landmine that is still capable of being detonated today.
To really grasp the shockwaves the Oera Linda Book sent through European intellectual life, we have to put ourselves back in that time. We have to recognize the specific emotional, the political climate of 19th century Europe.
Oh, absolutely. It was an era completely obsessed with defining itself. Political borders were fluid, monarchies felt unstable, and these emerging nations were just desperate for foundational myths.
They needed a story.
They needed a grand story. This period was defined by what historians call romantic nationalism. If you were trying to unify all these disparate peoples into one coherent nation-state, you desperately needed legitimacy. And in the 19th century, legitimacy was often quantified by antiquity.
The older your story, the more valid you were.
The further back you could push your national roots, the more ancient your culture, the greater your implied authority and your historical priority. It was that simple.
It almost became a historical arms race, didn't it? I mean, you see every region, from Germany reviving Teutonic sagas to Britain invoking Arthurian legends. Everyone was engaged in this intense search for glorious, deep origins.
And if you couldn't find a grand history,
there was a powerful incentive to invent one.
Exactly. Myth and history weren't just related. They were frequently synthesized. Intentionally, to fill these gaps where, maybe an inconvenient silence existed.
People were looking for evidence that their society, their people were descended from something purer, something stronger.
And something that stood alone, something outside of that dominant narrative of Greco-Roman origin. That desire for a non-Mediterranean origin story was, it was palpable, especially in the North.
And this cultural longing brings us directly to the specific geography of Friesland in the northern Netherlands.
Right. Friesland is unique. It's a region with its own distinct language, Frisian, its own fierce traditions, a deeply independent identity.
But it lacked the kind of global historical weight that, say, Germany or France could claim.
Frisian intellectuals felt culturally peripheral, but they craved to be central. They wanted concrete proof that their culture wasn't just surviving on the edges, but was a true European origin point. Maybe even one that predated the classical world.
They believed they were the inheritors of something vast, but they lacked the manuscript, the stone monument, or the accepted narrative to prove it.
And then, in the 1850s, the impossible suddenly materialized.
The way this document appeared is so crucial to its mystique, because the claim wasn't one of, archaeological excavation of digging up a forgotten tablet.
No, not at all. It was a claim of inheritance. It was presented as a private, sacred text.
And the man who brought it forward was a shipbuilder, Cornelis over de Linden.
Yes. And his explanation was both simple and deeply intriguing. He insisted his family had safeguarded this sacred inheritance, passing it down through a meticulous chain for centuries.
It was an ancestral text.
Hidden from outside eyes and supposedly passed primarily through the female line, from mother to daughter. This detail alone, Justin, it gives the book immense psychological power. It suggests a guarded truth, passed across time, protected by those traditionally excluded from formal history.
That detail is so critical to building the manuscript's mystique. The idea that it wasn't lost and then accidentally found, but rather intentionally preserved, in secret, waiting for just the right historical moment.
Oera Linda's assertion was that the world was finally ready for its truth, and he was just the reluctant guardian, fulfilling a generations-old duty.
But that raises an immediate critical question, doesn't it? If this text was passed mother to daughter for 2,000 years, why did the chain of custody suddenly culminate and stop with a male shipbuilder in the 1850s?
Right?
I mean, doesn't the lack of any institutional handoff or even continuous public display itself suggest extreme inauthenticity?
Well, that paradox is the engine of the entire mystery. The narrative of the secretive, duty-bound preservation, while it's emotionally compelling, it lacks any historical corroboration.
There's no paper trail.
None. A document this old, supposedly passed on for 2 millennia, should have some trace, some external acknowledgement, even an accidental mention in a legal document or a private letter somewhere in history. But there was nothing. The emergence was entirely self-contained.
And this duty-bound emergence, coupled with the book's specific content, it initiated an immediate, an unsettling reaction among scholars.
No, instantly. From the very moment the manuscript surfaced, experts in linguistics and history, they sensed that faint but unmistakable smell of inauthenticity. It was too polished, too convenient. It was too perfectly tailored to the cultural anxieties and historical longings of that exact year.
That critical first impression, that intuition that this was history reverse engineered, is what initiated the decades of controversy that followed.
They were looking at something that claimed to be a mirror of the deepest past, yet it reflected the political and moral anxieties of the 1850s with unsettling precision. That tension became the critical axis of the debate. Does this document represent ancient fact, or is it a modern fabrication?
The stage was set for one of the greatest textual battles of the 19th century. You had the traditional academic establishment on one side and this rising tide of nationalist aspiration on the other. Okay, let's turn the page now and just for a moment, suspend the skepticism. If we look purely at the narrative it contained, what exactly did this chronicle claim? Because the alternative history it presented wasn't just revised history. It was absolutely staggering in its scope and ambition.
The text presented itself as meticulous chronological record, a history stretching back over 2,000 years before the Christian era. And its format was critical to that. It was dry, it was relentlessly moralistic, and often, frankly, tedious in its detail.
Full of genealogies, dates, lists of rules.
Exactly. And that very tone, ironically, lent it authority for many early readers. It suggested it was produced by genuine ancient chroniclers focused on duty, not on drama.
And the centerpiece of this massive chronology was the lost world of Atlant. Tell us about this civilization. What kind of society did the Frisians supposedly descend from?
Atlant was described as the primordial ancestral homeland. It was situated far to the north and west of the European continent, possibly a great coastal landmass in the North Sea region.
And it wasn't depicted as just a group of disorganized tribes.
Not at all. It was a supremely advanced, powerful, and fertile civilization, a society built on strict law, advanced knowledge, trade, navigation. And crucially, the people were dedicated to truth, moral discipline, and communal responsibility.
And here's the truly provocative element, the thing that made it radical even in the 1870s, the nature of its leadership. This wasn't a world run by warrior kings or male emperors.
That's right. The political and spiritual authority rested entirely with women, specifically with priestesses known as the matras and the folk mothers.
Matras.
The matras were the ultimate spiritual guides and guardians of the written laws. They were selected for their profound wisdom and moral character, not heredity. The folk mothers served as judges, regional administrators, and historians.
And the core belief was that knowledge and law could only be preserved in their purest form when guarded by women.
Yes, women who were not tainted by the external ambition or vanity that supposedly afflicted men. That was the idea.
So, men were given important roles. They were the warriors, the protectors, the explorers, navigating the globe. But the ultimate spiritual and juridical authority rested with the female line. They were entrusted with preserving truth itself.
Right, and this concept of a highly literate, stable, and morally rigid northern matriarchy was a direct ideological challenge to every established historical and religious structure of the 19th century.
It offered a complete, structured alternative to the patriarchal foundations of both Greece and Rome, and to the centralized authority of the Catholic Church.
It did. The text emphasizes that Atlan's strength was derived from moral clarity, widespread literacy, and unyielding communal adherence to the written law. Not from military conquest or the divine right of kings, education was paramount, treated almost as a sacred ritual.
But this glorious civilization, according to the Chronicle, it wasn't eternal. The narrative is defined by these massive global catastrophes.
Yes, the Oera Linda Book details a series of devastating floods over generations, and crucially, these events, like the Key Deluge of 2194 BCE, they weren't presented as mere random natural disasters.
They were framed as cyclical divine punishments.
The inevitable consequence of internal moral decay, specifically the growing division and corruption caused by abandoning the pure law and tolerating foreign influence.
And this descent culminated in the ultimate reckoning, the shattering of Atlant itself.
A final, massive cataclysm sent the entire northern landmass beneath the ocean. It's a clear parallel to the myth of Atlantis, but here it's claimed as the literal, verifiable prehistory of the Frisian people. The survivors were scattered, forced to flee east and south in vast organized migrations.
And this is where the Chronicle demands a total historical rewrite. What became of these northern refugees?
Well, the book claims that these refugees from the drowned northern world were the source. They were the actual founders of classical civilizations. The text explicitly asserts that Greece, Rome, and even Egypt were not pristine origins, but rather corrupted offshoots of the far older Atlantic world.
So they inherited fragments of the knowledge?
Exactly. The written law, navigational science, building techniques, but they failed to maintain the moral discipline.
So Western history started pure in the cold north, only to degrade in the warm south.
Yeah.
And how did the text explain this degradation? What was the primary agent of corruption?
The rise of priesthoods and the abandonment of the simple universal written law. The manuscript has this uncompromisingly anti-clerical, anti-authoritarian worldview.
It portrays priests as cynical manipulators
Who introduce gods, rituals, and ultimately human sacrifice to consolidate power through manufactured fear and secrecy. Knowledge, which was once public and enshrined in law by the folk mothers, became secret, flexible, and subject to interpretation by new male elites.
In this narrative, the decline of humanity essentially began the moment tradition was abandoned, and religious figures, rather than written law, were elevated to power.
It's a history that just screams 19th century intellectual rebellion. The text is rigid, it's judgmental, and it's intensely focused on the need for racial and moral purity.
And for the Frisian nationalists who first embraced it, the message was incredibly powerful.
Oh, absolutely. You are the last, true, uncorrupted guardians of the very oldest, wisest tradition. The document provided a cosmic, indispensable role for a small, geographically marginal region. It was the ultimate historical vindication.
The tone and content perfectly aligned to give a sense of profound, hidden meaning. It promised a secret understanding of the world that only those who possessed the text or knew the Frisian language could fully unlock.
This glorious, self-vindicating story was exactly what a specific intellectual current in 19th century Europe desperately wanted to hear. But, history is rarely so emotionally convenient. The emergence of the Oera Linda Book triggered the methodical forensic work of skepticism.
Right. Moving beyond the narrative and focusing on the physical text, its language, its appearance.
They applied the basic scientific test. If this document is genuinely ancient, it must align perfectly when cross-referenced against every other known historical record, linguistic model, and archaeological finding from that time and place.
And the earliest, most damaging critiques came from specialists who understood the nuts and bolts of language evolution.
Right. Linguists had a wealth of actual medieval Frisian documents available for comparison charters, legal codes, land deeds, historical texts that covered centuries of linguistic development.
And these documents showed the messy, evolving nature of language.
Exactly. Sound shifts, spelling variations, grammatical rules dying out, and new ones emerging. The Oera Linda Book was subjected to this rigorous comparison.
And what was the specific red flag that kept appearing in the linguistic analysis?
Well, while the vocabulary was deliberately archaic and the spelling looked convincingly old on the surface, its underlying structure was deeply problematic. The grammar and sentence construction did not align cleanly with known medieval texts. They were too regular, too consistent.
And crucially, there was a disconcerting alignment with modern Dutch and modern Frisian habits, wasn't there?
A huge alignment. Rather than with established medieval usage, the text seemed to just skip centuries of natural linguistic drift.
You described this flaw before as linguistic flattening. Can you go deeper on that? What does that mean for an ancient manuscript?
Linguistic flattening means the text lacks the fingerprints of natural evolution. In a real manuscript that supposedly spans 2,000 years, you would expect to see spelling conventions dramatically change. Grammatical endings would fall off, certain words would become completely obsolete, only to be replaced by new ones.
So a genuine chronicle would show the scribes of 500 BCE using a different, messier language than the scribes of 500 CE.
Exactly. But in the Oera Linda Book, key concepts, political terminology, certain core religious terms, they maintain an almost identical spelling and grammatical structure across vast, supposedly 2,000-year timescales.
It reads like a performance.
It reads like a single, controlled performance written by someone who understood archaic style, but not the mechanics of linguistic change. It was too clean, too internally consistent to be real. It felt like someone had reverse engineered a dictionary from modern Frisian and deliberately inserted old-looking features.
The manuscript's unique angular script, which was one of its most seductive features, it appeared to be an alphabet from outside known history, that also became a critical point of failure under academic questioning.
That script instantly implied profound antiquity and secrecy to the public eye, but specialists asked the fundamental question, where did it come from and where did it go?
Because a successful writing system leaves traces.
Indelible traces across a culture. We should find its echo in inscriptions on stone, on metal artifacts, coins, or at least fragments of it used for decoration or simple notations in later periods.
But the Oera Linda script had no developmental trail whatsoever.
None. Zero. It appeared fully formed, conveniently contained within this single inherited document, and nowhere else in the known archaeological record of Friesland or Northern Europe. This is fatal to the claim of antiquity.
Real writing systems are messy.
They evolve. They are carved into hard materials, written on soft materials. They show intermediate forms. This Oera Linda alphabet felt like a closed system, existing only to protect the illusion of its own age. If it was the source of all European script, as the text claims, the continent should be littered with its fragments. It simply wasn't.
And beyond the linguistic and paleographic issues, the historical anachronisms were simply impossible to overlook. They often exposed the author's 19th century worldview.
Historians found these anachronisms to be, absolutely lethal. The text's social assumptions, its specific, intense focus on racial purity, its detailed critiques of centralized religious hierarchy, its specific anxieties about industrial-era social decline, they perfectly mirrored the intellectual and political battles of the 1800s.
So it felt less like a history from 2000 BCE and more like a 19th century political manifesto, just disguised as a history lesson.
Precisely. For instance, the text discusses specific geographical and political realities, like detailed trading routes or specific knowledge of certain far-flung peoples that could not have been known to an isolated Northern European society 4,000 years ago, but which were perfectly understood in the 1850s.
Her timeline conflicts were just too great to rationalize away.
Right. The way the book structured its narrative positioning Frisians as the origin civilization and then reverse engineering the timeline to make Greece and Rome their corrupted descendants, that revealed the author's conscious intent. It was designed to flatter a specific, marginalized cultural identity.
And good historical documents often complicate or contradict our assumptions.
The Oera Linda Book did the exact opposite. It delivered the perfect, ultimate origin story its audience craved.
So the consensus among mainstream academics solidified pretty quickly. The manuscript was a modern creation, a deliberate construction produced in the mid-19th century, designed to look older than it was.
The overwhelming weight of linguistic, paleographic, and historical evidence pointed to a sophisticated but ultimately traceable forgery. Even the material analysis itself, while secondary, did not help the book's case. The convenient, untraceable chain of custody, the lack of any physical damage or fading you'd expect from a document handled across centuries.
All these details forced skepticism to be the only rational academic position.
And the central challenge became not proving it was fake, but proving why. Why someone would go to such incredible lengths to invent it.
The mystery now shifts from antiquity to authorship.
And if we accept the solid consensus that this is a modern text, the central mystery deepens dramatically. It moves into the realm of human psychology. We are no longer asking if it's true, but why it was fabricated.
I mean, what kind of person or specific circle of people dedicates years to inventing an entire alphabet, mastering an archaic linguistic style, and crafting a sprawling, internally consistent 4,000-year moral history?
Typically, large-scale hoaxes have a clear motive, often financial, or they're designed purely for sensational fame. But the story of Cornelis over de Linden, the shipbuilder, that complicates the assumption.
He didn't seem to profit from it.
No, over de Linden himself did not become wealthy from the book. He didn't chase international celebrity, only regional recognition for fulfilling a supposed duty. His stated motive was obligation sharing, a sacred inheritance, not invention or crude monetary gain.
And this lack of an obvious, clear financial motive meant the accusation of fraud became much more nuanced.
It pointed overwhelmingly to a deeper, non-monetary, ideological drive behind the fabrication.
This complexity opens the door to three compelling and often competing theories about the true author's intent. While Over de Linden was the presenter, intellectual historians suggest the true mastermind was likely a member of his close circle, someone with the necessary knowledge.
People like Dr. Eels Witteveen, a physician, or J.G. Ozinga, a teacher and archivist, both of whom had the necessary linguistic and historical knowledge to construct such a coherent text.
Okay, so let's analyze motive A, nationalist propaganda.
This is the most straightforward interpretation. Friesland was striving to assert its distinct identity against the Dutch political establishment. The Oera Linda Book gave them the ultimate historical foundation.
It reframed their local culture as the very source of Western civilization,
granting immense regional pride and historical leverage. The text's consistent emphasis on the Frisian people as the final, pure remnants of Atlantic knowledge certainly aligns perfectly with an attempt to establish a powerful foundational myth justifying cultural autonomy.
The authors might have seen it as a patriotic necessity, creating a story so grand and so unique that it would elevate their marginalized language and region onto the world stage. It's nation-building through historical fiction.
Absolutely. Just think of the psychological lift. Instead of being a small region on the periphery of Europe, they suddenly become the direct inheritors of the world's first great civilization. That kind of narrative power can mobilize identity in profound ways.
But then we move to motive B, which requires a specific, cynical, intellectual mindset. The theory that this was intended as a sophisticated satirical stunt.
This theory suggests the creators were not nationalists trying to build a nation, but rather intellectual critics mocking the entire era's obsession with invented origins.
So they were watching the historical arms race.
The Germans romanticizing the North, the British clinging to Arthur, and decided to create the ultimate, perfectly tailored, ridiculous origin story. They created a mirror held up to the longing of the age, intending to expose how easily people would fall for a grand narrative if it flattered their ego.
The idea being that the creators planted the perfect trap, but the manuscript was taken seriously by those it was intended to mock, and the joke just escaped their control.
It's a compelling theory because it explains the extreme level of intellectual gamesmanship and complexity required to construct the text, the invented script, the subtle linguistic manipulations, the detailed history. Only a very clever, perhaps arrogant intellectual circle would attempt such a monumental prank.
And once it was out there and taken seriously, they couldn't exactly take it back.
Right. They may have realized they couldn't possibly admit the joke without ruining their own reputations, trapping them inside their own creation.
And then there is motive C, which frames the Oera Linda Book as an explicit, sustained ideological weapon against the present day.
This is a powerful interpretation because the text is so intensely moralistic. It's not just history, it's a manual for living. It praises extreme order, rigid adherence to codes, absolute tradition, and purity,
while viciously attacking what the 19th century represented: urban chaos, industrial greed, the perceived decline of moral standards, and the power of organized religion.
Exactly. This reads less like a historical prank and more like a moral manifesto disguised as an ancient chronicle. The creators may have sought to critique their contemporary world or guide its future by contrasting it with this idealized, highly disciplined, matriarchal past.
The internal consistency really does support the idea of intentional focused design, doesn't it? Regardless of the ultimate motive.
It does. Critics noted it was not a confused accumulation of folklore, but the seamless work of one mind or one circle of minds, ensuring the moral messages were coherent throughout. The decline of Atlan always mirrors the moral failure of later societies, following a precise, established pattern of warnings and consequences. That meticulous control speaks to a strong, conscious authorship.
And this whole debate about intent created an extraordinary paradox of belief. The more methodically scholars attacked the book with facts and linguistic proof, the more devoted its believers became.
Yes, once the manuscript became a cultural symbol, a symbol of marginalized identity, and Northern pride academic rejection became, ironically, its greatest source of strength.
So the believers interpreted the dismantling by experts not as proof of fabrication,
but as proof of institutional elitism, a cover-up, a deliberate attempt to suppress ancient knowledge that threatened the academic status quo. Belief became fundamentally tied to identity and a deep-seated distrust of authority, rendering the entire story immune to correction by facts.
The academic argument against the book became, in the eyes of its devotees, a core tenet of believing in the book.
It's a fascinating and troubling dynamic.
Here's where the story takes its most complex and perhaps darkest turn. Once the Oera Linda Book was definitively dismissed by mainstream historians as a forgery, it didn't just fade away into forgotten obscurity, it migrated immediately into the realm of forbidden knowledge.
Right. A shadowy cultural space where factual verification no longer holds sway.
That is the enduring power of a successful myth, isn't it?
It is. When a narrative is rejected by authorities, it often gains instant validation among groups who are already deeply suspicious of universities, government, and mainstream narratives. Rejection becomes proof of its importance. It moved swiftly into the cultural bloodstream of fringe history movements and spiritual seekers who were looking for evidence that the established world history was a lie.
It offered a convenient, ready-made narrative structure for anyone searching for a lost, non-Christian, hyper-advanced spiritual homeland, the perfect alternative to accepted Western foundations.
Precisely. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was eagerly adopted by various occult and esoteric circles. Groups fascinated by the concept of Atlantis and hidden spiritual wisdom, they treated Atlan as a lost spiritual precursor.
The book's core themes, cataclysm, a lost alphabet, a secret, pure tradition, cosmic cycles. It all fit perfectly into those frameworks.
It did. For these groups, historical authenticity was secondary to the symbolic power and the narrative's ability to explain the mysteries of existence.
But the shadow that endures takes its most troubling, dangerous form when we examine the selective reinterpretation the manuscript underwent.
Yes. As the book circulated among ideological groups, it was ruthlessly stripped of its nuance. This is the danger zone. While the original text heavily emphasized matriarchy, literacy, and moral discipline, later adopters often ignored those elements entirely.
Because they didn't serve the new narrative.
Exactly. The focus shifted purely to themes of purity, decline, and ancient Northern dominance.
And this is the mechanism by which a fraudulent manuscript becomes weaponized by harmful ideologies.
It was seized upon, particularly in the early 20th century, by certain ideological extremists who were deeply invested in racial and historical mythology. The concept of a superior, racially pure, ancient Northern civilization whose wisdom was subsequently corrupted by Southern peoples. It provided a powerful, false historical anchor.
A narrative that was used to justify exclusion and hierarchy.
And a specific dark vision of history. The original message of matriarchal law was forgotten. Only the themes of Northern exceptionalism and purity remained.
It reminds us of other infamous fabricated texts, where the document's power lies not in its truth, but in its ability to confirm existing biases and flatter the identity of a specific targeted group.
It is a painful and repetitive pattern. Pseudo-history becomes profoundly potent when it flatters a group's ego and tells them they are ancient, chosen, or superior to others. The Oera Linda Book, having already been exposed as fraudulent, became more appealing to those who inherently believed that official truth was being actively suppressed by shadowy elites.
So the harm caused by these texts is not rooted in what they can scientifically prove,
but purely in how desperately they are believed and utilized to justify terrible ideas.
Given this troubling cultural legacy, how do modern historians approach the Oera Linda Book today? Is it still just a footnote in a history of hoaxes?
Absolutely not. Today, the debate over its authenticity is entirely settled. Modern scholars study it not as history, but as a crucial cultural artifact, a remarkably detailed, complex window into the precise intellectual and spiritual anxieties of the 19th century.
So as a piece of fabricated literature, it's intellectually brilliant.
And as a social phenomenon, it reveals the deep fault lines in society, the hunger for certainty, the intense mistrust of authority, and the absolute yearning for historical justification during a period of massive social change.
It stands as a perfect demonstration of how complex language can be manufactured to sound ancient, and how deeply held political or moral agendas can be masqueraded as objective historical chronicles.
And critically, it reveals how readers constantly project their desires onto a text, rather than objectively extracting meaning from the evidence. The manuscript ultimately shows the profound danger of treating history as something to be used, as a political tool or ideological foundation, rather than simply understood, studied, and debated.
Its impact proved that the emotional resonance of a story can far outweigh the weight of empirical proof.
This chronicle of shadows, through its very deception, accomplished something truly profound and undeniable.
It exposed precisely how tenuous the line is between verifiable, documented evidence and a compelling desired narrative.
It proved that a story doesn't need to be factually accurate to be immensely powerful. It only needs to speak to a deep, unfulfilled need within a culture. The lesson is terrifyingly simple. Hoaxes only disappear when people stop needing them to explain their world. We have seen today how an invented history, once exposed, can become entirely immune to factual correction, precisely because it speaks so powerfully to a collective identity.
Right, it offers a clear, simple, and satisfying answer to the complex question of why the modern world feels imperfect or broken.
It's far easier to believe in a grand, ancient fall from grace than to grapple with messy, intractable modern problems.
So what does this entire saga mean for us, the people trying to navigate a world saturated with information? The Oera Linda Book is a perfect mirror. It reflects our own hunger for certainty, our susceptibility to seductive narratives, and our deep-seated need for historical justification.
It tells us virtually nothing about ancient Frisians, but it illuminates volumes about ourselves and the psychological architecture of belief.
It is undeniable proof that a perfectly constructed narrative shapes belief far more powerfully than brute facts often can.
Especially when that narrative offers prestige to the believer.
Consider this for your next moment of reflection. If a community's entire sense of identity is fundamentally founded upon an ancient, discredited manuscript, does the methodical act of revealing the forgery necessarily destroy that community? Or, conversely, does the sheer power of the enduring belief in the story simply become a new, unassailable cultural truth? Think about the overwhelming weight of a story that people truly want to be true, and whether that specific, potent desire can ever be truly defeated by documented fact.